Had Timothy Evans killed all these women as well as his own wife and child? What did they do next?
They went to the next room and they found the wife, Ethel Christie, under the floorboards.
Having discovered the body of John Christie's wife, detectives now became convinced of his involvement.
Now, it must have been dawning on them that the prospect of having two murderers in the same flat were fairly remote. We've already had Evans hanged for one murder on this property. Two murders.
Yes, but the extraordinary thing is, a statement was given in the newspapers. Detectives do not believe there is any connection between these murders and the two that occurred in 1949.
Christie had not been seen since he'd left Rillington Place, and the police were anxious to trace him.
It must have been a sensation in London to have had 4 women discovered buried in a house.
Absolutely. They knew that he'd killed these people, and his face was on the front of every newspaper. And the headline in some cases was, "When will he strike again?"
But Christie had no money and nowhere to go. On the 31st of March 1953, PC Thomas Ledger saw a man leaning over the embankment at Putney Bridge. When the young policeman asked him who he was, the reply was John Waddington, 35 Westbourne Grove. The officer asked him to remove his hat, and the balding features confirmed what he suspected. The hunt for Christie was over.
When searching the garden, they discovered the skeletons of 2 other females, one of which was lacking its head and its femur.
After being buried for many years, all these vertebrae were discovered and used as evidence in the trial. Many more bones were about to be uncovered.
The femur had worked its way to the top of the soil, and Christie had used it to prop up the garden fence. When the head also came up, he took it up, walked around the corner to St Mark's Road and dropped it into a bombed house.
Also found 110 separate fragments of a skull belonging to one of Christie's victims. The pieces were reconstructed and shown to come from Ruth First, Christie's first victim.
When he dug the first grave with the first victim hidden away in the wash house, people waved him and said, "Hello, Reg, you doing some gardening?" That's what the sort of person he was. He was Reg, who did a bit of gardening, and was well known in the area. Solid citizen.
While in custody at Brixton Prison, Christie made no secret of his violence against women. Solicitors, fellow inmates, and eventually the press were treated to detailed accounts of his murderous desires. Christie had enjoyed each killing, and his victims all met the same fate, slow strangulation. His murders were calculated. With his manipulation skills, women were lured back to 10 Rillington Place, where they enjoyed a cup of tea before their kindly host suddenly moved to throttle them.
It must have been obvious from the start it was Christie who did it.
There was the presence of semen, John Christie's semen, in all of their bodies.
Is there evidence that some of them were, as it were, sexually assaulted after they were dead?
He was never clear about this. He was never clear whether he had sex before, during, or afterwards. He talks about this wonderful sensation of release and pleasure and satisfaction looking down at the dead body. It's when the sex and the death theme coalesce.
Christie would later confess that he killed Beryl Evans too. He was now linked to 7 murders. But, like Evans, he could only be prosecuted for 1 homicide at a time. And he was tried for the murder of his wife, Ethel Christie. His trial began in Number 1 Court at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of June 1953. It was in this same courtroom 3 years earlier that Timothy Evans had been convicted of killing his wife.
Did he confess straight away?
Yes, he confessed, but of course he didn't confess to murder. What he confessed to was a series of mercy killings. He said that his wife had been extremely nervous, and she'd been taking tablets, and one day she'd taken too many phenobarbital tablets and convulsed in the night, and he felt that he had to put her out of her misery, was the phrase he used. So he strangled her. Most people would have grabbed a pillow, I think, and smothered the person in those circumstances. He had his strangling rope, a phrase he used several times, strangled her, and then buried her under the floorboards in the next room. And when asked why he did this, he said, well, I wanted to have her close to me. And when he said this in court, he smiled as if he'd scored a huge debating point.
During the trial, Christie's defence was based on the McNaughton rules, which date back to 1843. The rules state that a man is not guilty if, at the time of his actions, he did not know that he was doing wrong. But Christie knew all too well. Medical experts said he was abnormal and conceited, but not suffering from any mental illness. On the fourth day of the trial, the jury was sent out at 4:05 p.m. to make its decision. The members returned 82 minutes later. Christie was found guilty of the murder of his wife. As the death sentence was passed, Christie said nothing. He was hanged at Pentonville on the 15th of July, 1953. All this was 3 years too late for Timothy Evans, who'd been hanged in 1950 for the murder of his baby daughter. He had professed his innocence right up to the day that he died, blaming the murders of his daughter and his wife on John Reginald Christie.
So what happened after that, as far as poor old Timothy Evans was concerned?
Well, Timothy Evans was still in Pentonville Prison, of course, where he'd been buried, and there was a huge outcry after the death of Christie, and eventually, years later, in 1965, they demanded an inquiry, but they said he'd probably killed his wife, but that Christie had probably killed the daughter. And since he'd been charged with the murder of his daughter, there was a posthumous pardon for Timothy Evans.
It seems a most peculiar finding.
It's most bizarre, and I think the problem is when we say that Evans was innocent, that makes him sound like a shining white saint. He wasn't at all. We're talking about somebody who was a dreadful boaster and liar and scrounger, and at the very least, he condoned the illegal abortion of his wife. And when that went wrong, as he thought, because that was the explanation given to him, he was an accessory after the fact of her death. So he should have gone to prison for those crimes anyway. But what he didn't do was to take part in the murder of either his wife or his daughter.
So what do we know today about the still notorious John Reginald Christie?
He had an obsession with death from a very early age. When he saw his grandfather, who terrified him for years, laid out as a corpse, he had this tremendous sense of not of pleasure so much as satisfaction and fascination. And at this point, they were living in a house, would you believe, overlooking All Souls Church Cemetery. And he would play amongst the gravestones and would always peer in through the vaults with cracks in.
What were his sexual problems?
He always talked about the significant event in his childhood being an occasion when he'd been to church and came out with all his pals, and they went off down Lover's Lane, which was called the Monkey Run, and they paired off. And he had a particularly experienced girl, obviously wanted full satisfaction. He was unable to perform. She told the rest of them, so thenceforth he was known as Can't Do It Christie or Reggie No Dick. He'd been publicly humiliated in a way that is difficult to come out from, as it were.
So fascination with
death, and then later a fascination with sex. And when the two coalesce, as they did with the first murder, that's when things really got out of hand.
Among the artefacts that were recovered, one of them at the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard, is this.
This is a tobacco tin that was found in the garden containing the pubic hair of 4 different women. In one of the postscripts to his statements to the police, he said, the 4 pieces of pubic hair come from the 3 women found here and from my wife. Well, of course, they had a forensic examination of it. They discovered that the 3 victims here had no connection with the pubic hair. The wife was an inconclusive decision because she had pubic hair very common to a large number of women. Since you couldn't place these pubic hairs with any of the victims in the house, that meant they were either other victims or people from whom he took these as mementos.
But it does leave the chilling prospect that there might have been other victims.
Oh, no question. And in prison, he boasted about other victims.
The wrongful conviction and hanging of Timothy Evans was the catalyst that eventually led to the abolition of the death penalty in Britain. In 1966, he was posthumously pardoned.
Christie, of course, is still a symbol of horror. Rillington Place no longer exists.
For 130 years, the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard has been archiving the tools, the relics and the instruments of the most notorious killers, the most infamous conmen, the most audacious of thieves. Nowadays it's a training ground for police and judiciary, but it's also a sombre reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and a tribute to the triumphs of Scotland Yard.